My son tugged at the sleeve of my blazer before we even got out of the car. Not hard. Just 2 fingers at the cuff, a quick little straightening motion like he was fixing a napkin on a table somebody else might judge. Then he looked at the jacket again, not at me, and said, "Let's keep things easy tonight, Dad." I was 71 years old, and in that small pause between his hand leaving my arm and the car door opening, I felt about 12. The parking lot at Briar Glen Country Club sloped gentle toward the main entrance where lantern-style lights were already on against the spring dusk. You could smell fresh-cut grass, damp stone, and the buttery drift of whatever they had going in the banquet kitchen. Cars gleamed in neat rows under the sycamores. Men in sport coats and women in sleeved dresses were making their way up the walk in pairs, talking low, all of them looking like they knew where to put their hands and what fork went where once they got inside. I looked down at my jacket. Brown herringbone thrift store in Mechanicsburg, $12 as good shoulders. June would have liked it. She used to say a jacket didn't need a name stitched in it if it sat right on a man and didn't make him look like he was apologizing for his own bones. "I am keeping it easy," I said. Daniel gave a short smile without much warmth in it. "You know what I mean." He was 42 and had learned somewhere between law school and partnership track how to say sharp things in a voice so smooth they almost came through as concern. Navy suit. Pale blue tie shoes that caught the light. He looked good. He had his mother's cheekbones and my father's long hands, though you wouldn't know where the hands came from watching the way he held them now, careful, polished, never a nick or stain. I opened my door and got out. The evening air had that damp Pennsylvania cool that settles in after a warm day. Daniel came around the hood and pressed the lock button with a chirp. "Just let me do the talking if we end up with clients," he said. "A lot of this is just reading the room." I stood there a second with the clubhouse lights reflected in the windshield behind him. "I've been reading rooms longer than you've been alive." He gave a little laugh, but it was the kind a man uses when he wants to move past something instead of answer it. "Sure, I just mean this room." The walk up to the entrance was lined with low boxwoods and beds of tulips gone a little ragged at the edges. Somebody had put out white string lights in the trees around the patio, and through the big front windows I could see waitstaff moving with trays over their shoulders. At the door, a girl no older than my granddaughter was checking names off a list on a black podium. Daniel stepped slightly ahead of me. Not enough for another person to notice, maybe. Enough for me to— "Mercer Hale," he said. Daniel Mercer Hale. He'd changed it from Hensley 4 years ago when he married Lydia Mercer, whose father had his name on a brick wing at the regional hospital and whose mother still chaired 2 charity boards and a Christmas house tour. He said the combined name made more sense professionally. I told him names were his business. I didn't say much else. The girl found him and smiled. "Of course. Welcome." Then Daniel put one hand lightly against the middle of my back, not introducing me so much as moving me through the doorway. "This is Walt," he said. Walt. Not my father, not my dad. Just Walt like I was a plumber who'd shown up late or a neighbor he'd promised to include. The girl smiled at me too because she was raised right. "Welcome, sir." Inside, the front hall opened onto dark wood-polished brass old rugs with reds worn soft over time, and that quiet, expensive smell old clubs have: lemon oil, carpeting, coffee, and money that's been sitting still long enough to stop needing to mention itself. To the left, a hallway led toward framed photos and a set of windows looking out over the course. Straight ahead, double doors stood open to the banquet room where silverware flashed under chandeliers and the steady murmur of 200 people rolled together like far-off water. I took in the woodwork without meaning to. Crown moldings, clean corners. Good trim lines, a run of paneling near the hall that had been redone by somebody who knew not to over-sand old oak. My eyes went there the way some men notice watches or cars. Habit. Daniel noticed me noticing. "Try not to wander," he said. "We've got our table assignment." Something in me tightened, then small but real. I thought of him at 10 years old in the elementary school gym before the winter concert, asking if I had to come straight from work. I'd had sawdust in my cuffs and a split across one knuckle from a warped joist, and he'd kept looking at the other fathers in wool coats while I stood there in my cleanest flannel. He never said he was ashamed back then. Kids don't need the word for you to feel the thing. I told myself now, what I used to tell myself then. He was nervous. Work event. Important people. Don't go looking for bruises where there's only clumsiness. A server with a tray of club soda passed, and Daniel took one without asking if I wanted anything. Come on. The banquet room had round tables with cream linens, folded place cards, little vases of white roses. A long bar ran against the far wall under a row of mirrors. Men in jackets the color of wet stone and new pennies shook hands around the room. A woman near the piano was laughing with one hand over her chest in a way that said she'd done it in rooms like this for years. Out beyond the glass, the course rolled dark and soft into the evening. Daniel led me to a table near the side, close enough to see the room, far enough not to be in its center. Not terrible, not hidden. Just placed. I need to make a round, he said. Say hello to a few people before dinner. That's fine. He glanced at my jacket again. And maybe keep the stories light if folks come by. No contractor war stories. I looked at him. You mean no stories where things were built by men in cheap coats? Color rose up his neck a little. Dad, come on. Then he smiled at somebody passing and the whole face changed. Smooth again. Easy. He was gone before I could decide whether I wanted him gone. I sat down for a minute, then stood back up because sitting there alone at a half-filled table felt worse than standing. There was a basket of rolls under a folded napkin nearby and a bowl of foil-wrapped butter pats sweating slightly into the dish. Across the room I could see Daniel already in motion, hand on shoulder here, light laugh there, leaning in just enough to look interested and never enough to seem needy. He was good at it. I'll give him that. He could enter a group of strangers and leave 10 minutes later, having made them feel they had always expected him. A woman in a green dress stopped by. Mid-60s hair set neatly diamond studs. You must be with Daniel, she said. I am, she smiled. He's wonderful. So polished. I nodded once. He's worked hard. There was a pause where she might have asked what I was to him. She didn't. She moved on with her drink, and I stood there with my thumb rubbing the seam of my jacket. After a while, Daniel came back with a man in rimless glasses and a red tie. Craig, this is Walt, he said. My father. There it was, after all. But he said it with the same tone a person might use to disclose an old knee injury. Information, not belonging. Craig shook my hand. Pleasure, sir. Good to meet you. Daniel gave a little chuckle. Dad was always more comfortable around lumber than linen. Craig laughed because that is what men do when another man hands them the shape of a joke, and the room is pleasant enough to use it. Not cruelly, not loudly, just enough. I felt the laugh hit me lower than it should have. There are humiliations that come from strangers and humiliations that come from the person who has known your hands since they were big enough to wrap around his whole foot. Those land different. Lumber's honest, I said. Craig smiled like he wasn't sure whether I'd meant to be funny. Daniel was already half-turned toward the next conversation. A server passed with bacon-wrapped scallops. I took one because it gave me something to do. The glaze was sweet and smoky, and for one absurd second, I thought of church potlucks, foil pans on folding tables, June balancing deviled eggs on one palm while telling Claire not to touch the lemon bars yet. I could almost hear the old fellowship hall chairs scraping over linoleum. This room was prettier. People still ate off plates. I drifted toward the side hallway under the excuse of stretching my legs. Framed photos lined the wall, their club tournaments, ribbon cuttings, men in white slacks from the 70s, ladies with lacquered hair and trophies. The farther down I went, the older the pictures got. One of them stopped me before I knew I'd stopped, black and white. Smoke dark beams stacked out on the lawn, scaffolding up along a half-opened wall. A row of men in work boots and denim standing shoulder to shoulder under a temporary banner that read, West Wing Restoration Committee. Younger faces, leaner waists, harder light in the eyes. Mine was third from the left. I stared at it long enough that the room behind me went soft and far away. The hair dark, the shoulders broader. Pencil tucked behind one ear, my hand resting on my hip the way it always did when I was halfway between tired and not done. For a second I could smell it again. The old burn in the wiring, wet plaster char still buried inside the wall cavities, fresh-cut oak coffee from a thermos gone metallic by noon. And all evening my son had been acting like I didn't know what kind of room I was standing in. I stood there looking at that photograph long enough for the voices from the banquet room to flatten into one low-mannered hum. There was a smaller frame mounted beneath it, cream paper gone a little yellow at the edges under the glass. I leaned closer. Briar Glen Bulletin, October 1987. A short write-up about the West Wing reopening after the electrical fire. Committee chairman donors, architect contractors. Halfway down in smaller print than the men who'd paid for things was my name. Foreman Walter Hensley, Hensley Restoration and Carpentry. I read it twice. It was not vanity. I don't think I have much of that left in me if I ever had it. It was something stranger and sharper. All night, I'd been taking my son's little corrections like maybe I had wandered into somebody else's world wearing the wrong coat. Meanwhile, my name had been under glass in the hallway the whole time, and I'd built part of the damn place with my own hands. A laugh carried out from the room behind me, Daniel's among the others. I knew his laugh. He had one for home, one for church, one for strangers, and one for men. He needed something from. The one I heard now was the polished one, easy and low, with just enough warmth to make people feel chosen. I looked back at the photograph. We had worked that job through a wet fall. The fire had started behind a service wall near the old wiring run and gotten farther than anybody first thought. Smoke damage, hidden charring weakened joists where the heat had sat too long. The board wanted it done quickly because there was a winter fundraiser scheduled and insurance people breathing down their necks. I remember standing in a gutted corridor with a flashlight in my teeth while two men in blazers talked about cost over my shoulder as if the walls weren't open and speaking plain English already. One of them had wanted to sister over a compromised beam and close it up. I told him if he wanted my crew's name on the job, we weren't bearing damage to save a date on a calendar. That sort of thing had always been simple to me. A beam was sound, or it wasn't. A man's word was the same. I heard Daniel's steps before I turned around. "There you are," he said. Not angry, not relieved either. "Just controlled. I told you not to wander." "I didn't wander," I said. I was looking. His eyes moved to the photo, then to the bulletin, then back to me. There was the quickest break in his face. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition. He knew enough to know what I was seeing. "That old stuff's probably all over the place," he said. "Come on. They're about to seat people." I kept my eyes on the frame another second. "You know I worked here." He shifted his weight. "I know you did some job here ages ago. Some job." I nodded once and let him lead me back, because for 30 years of fatherhood, I had told myself there was wisdom in picking your spots. Maybe there is. Maybe there was. But there is also cowardice that dresses itself up in patience, and by then I was close enough to the age where a man ought to know the difference. At the table, the rolls had been opened, and the butter was going soft. A woman across from me with a silver bracelet was telling the story of a grandchild's travel soccer schedule, like it was a military deployment. Daniel sat 2 seats down, angled toward the table's center in his element again. He included me when somebody looked my way and edited me when they didn't. My dad worked construction. Dad's always been old school. He still likes paper maps, small things, harmless if you wrote them down one at a time. By the 10th one, they had shape. Nancy Doyle appeared at my shoulder before the salad plates were cleared. June's cousin. She lived in Camp Hill and had married a dentist who golfed here twice a week and believed every meal after age 60 should come with iced tea and pie. Nancy had a way of arriving quietly enough that people forgot how much she noticed. "Well," she said, putting a hand on my arm, "they sat you with the orchids and the litigation." I smiled despite myself. Looks that way. Her eyes flicked once toward Daniel, then back to me. "You doing all right?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Nancy had always been dangerous in a gentle voice. June used to say Nancy could pull a splinter out of a man without him noticing till she held it up to the light. I looked down at the tablecloth. "He's just trying to manage the room." That was all she said, but the sound sat between us with more weight than a speech would have. She squeezed my sleeve once and moved on to her husband's table. The fish came out under a pale sauce with asparagus laid across it like ruler marks. Around us, forks clicked against china, and somebody near the front tested a microphone once, then thought better of it. I ate what was in front of me and answered when spoken to, and found myself growing quieter. Not because I had nothing to say, but because every time I started, Daniel's body would tighten half an inch like he was waiting to intercept. At one point, I was talking to the man beside me about old houses in Camp Hill, and I mentioned knob and tube wiring hiding under blown insulation in walls people swore had been fully updated. Before I'd finished the thought, Daniel leaned in, smiling. "My dad can spot a bad beam from 50 feet away," he said. "Put him in a ballroom and he starts looking for exits and electrical problems." The table laughed, lightly, kindly, the way people laugh when a son is making his father charming. I smiled, because there are humiliations you can either swallow whole or spit onto the tablecloth, and I had spent most of my life choosing the swallow. But something in that moment went colder inside me than it had in the hall. Because the joke wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a method. He was telling them how to hold me. Not dangerous, not equal, not serious. Decorative, harmless from another world. I remembered then a night from Daniel's senior year of high school. Parent night for scholarship families at the prep school he'd gotten into on grades and baseball, and more sacrifice than he ever fully knew the cost of. I had left a roofing estimate half finished, showered in 10 minutes, put on my best sport coat, and driven across town with June riding beside me in her pearl earrings from JCPenney. In the parking lot, Daniel had seen me step out of the truck and said, "Dad, maybe don't talk about work stuff tonight, okay? Not mean, embarrassed." June heard him too. She put one hand on my wrist before I could answer and said, cheerful as church bells, "Your father's work paid for the gas that got us here." We went in. Nobody mentioned it again. That had been her gift in the family. She could stop a wrong thing before it settled into the wood. 6 years since she died, and all kinds of things had begun settling. After dinner, they opened the side doors to the terrace for coffee and dessert. The evening had cooled. Small groups drifted with cups and saucers, the men loosening in the shoulders now that the business part was done. Daniel was better after meals, less tense. He'd made his rounds. He had handshakes in the bank. I was standing just inside the doorway with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm when I saw him watching me from across the room. Not looking for me, watching me, measuring. He had the same expression he'd worn when he was 16 and I showed up to a team dinner in my work boots because I'd come straight from finishing a porch rail in Carlisle. Back then, I had mistaken that look for adolescent embarrassment, something a boy grows out of when he gets enough life in him to understand cost. Standing there in a room my hands had once helped put back together, I understood with a heaviness that felt almost peaceful how wrong I'd been. He had not grown out of it. He had built himself out of it. The thought cost me more than I expected. It wasn't only that he was ashamed. It was that the shame had become useful to him. A man in a dinner jacket brushed past me, nearly spilling his coffee, and I stepped aside toward the photo hallway again without thinking much about where I was going. The black and white frame was still there, quiet as a fact. Beneath it, the bulletin. Around the corner, the banquet room glowed gold and expensive. "Excuse me," a voice said behind me. I turned. He was a tall man, older than Daniel, younger than me by a handful of years, silver hair, cut close, jacket buttoned, though most men had already opened theirs. I knew the face in the way you know faces from newspapers left in diners and charity pages you don't read closely but can't quite avoid. Russell Pembroke, club president, real estate, banking, hospital board, all of it. He looked at me with the focused politeness of a man trying to place a memory, and then his whole expression changed. "Sir," he said, just that at first. "Sir." Then he put out his hand. "I'll be damned." Walter Hensley. The hallway felt suddenly too still. I took his hand. "Yes, sir." He laughed softly. No, not from you." He looked back toward the room as if the fact of me being there had shifted something in his understanding of the evening. "You're the reason that West Wing didn't turn into a patch job and a lawsuit 30 years later." Two men standing near the dessert table turned. Daniel did too. Russell stepped toward the frame and touched the corner of the bulletin under the glass. "I was a junior board member when all that happened. Young enough to think money solved every problem and old enough to remember being corrected. You told my uncle in this very hallway that if he wanted the work signed off, he could stop asking you to cover fire damage with pretty wood. A sound came out of me that was almost a laugh. That does sound like me. It does. He smiled and looked back toward the room again. We still quote that line at facilities meetings when somebody gets cute about repairs. By then, Daniel had crossed half the room. His face was composed, but there was color up high in his cheeks. Russell went on, unaware, or pretending to be. You saved us from making a very expensive fool's decision. Harold still talks about that beam issue, as if summoned. Harold, older, now thick through the middle, carrying a folded linen from a service station, looked up from near the bar. Stared a beat too long and then broke into a grin. Well, I'll be, he said. Walt Hensley. Harold Brewer had been 28 when he hauled salvage with us. He had more hair then and less caution. Now he was head of grounds and facilities or something near enough, but his grip was the same when he took my hand. Strong, calloused, no performance in it. Thought that was you, he said. Told my grandson last month about the foreman who scared a room full of rich men into fixing a place properly. A few people laughed. Not at me this time. Daniel reached us just as Harold stepped back. Russell turned with a pleased sort of surprise. Daniel, you didn't mention your father was Walter Hensley. There are moments when the room goes quiet without actually going quiet. The music still played. Glasses still touched. Somebody somewhere still asked for decaf. But all the air around the four of us changed. Daniel smiled, and it was a good smile, practiced and handsome and almost enough if a person wanted to believe it. Dad doesn't usually make a thing of his old jobs. Russell looked between us. Some work makes its own thing. He nodded once to me, then excused himself to speak to a couple waiting by the terrace. Harold clapped my shoulder and moved off toward the service station with his folded linen. And there I stood in the hallway with the picture under glass, my son beside me, and the truth hanging between us where neither of us could pretend not to see it. Daniel lowered his voice. Please, he said, still smiling for the room, though his eyes had gone flat. Don't make this into a whole thing. That was when I knew all at once, and without any room left for kindness to hide in, that I was done helping him do this to me. I looked at him for a long second, long enough that his smile began to slip at the corners. Around us, the room kept moving. Waiters lifted dessert plates. Somebody laughed too hard at something near the bar. The pianist in the corner had started into a soft standard I half recognized, but the hallway where we stood had gone still in the way certain places do when the truth has already arrived and is waiting to see whether anybody will insult it. Daniel. I said that's been your whole problem for years. His jaw tightened. Dad, no. My voice surprised even me by how calm it sounded. You don't get to tell me to keep things simple now. He looked past my shoulder, once checking who might be close enough to hear. That was the habit, not what was right. Who was near? I'm trying to avoid a scene, he said. That's interesting, I said, because you weren't worried about a scene when you were making jokes about my jacket. Color rose in his face again, deeper this time. It was a joke. It was a pattern. The words came out before I had much chance to dress them up, which was probably for the best. Some truths turn false the minute you try to make them pretty. Daniel dropped his smile altogether. You're reading too much into this. I almost laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because I had spent so many years doing exactly the opposite. Reading too little into it, sanding rough edges off moments I ought to have let stand sharp in my mind. Giving him the benefit of every doubt, until the doubt itself had become a habit. You know what I think, I said. I think all evening you've been trying to decide how much of me you could let into the room without it getting on you. His eyes flashed at that. That's not fair. No, I said. What's not fair is spending your whole life building a floor under somebody's feet and then watching him act like your boots are the problem. For a second, he said nothing. The hallway light caught the edge of the old photograph beside us. Younger men in work jeans, arms folded, shoulders broad, all of us squinting into October sun. I could feel June somewhere behind my ribs. Then, not like a ghost, not in any foolish way, just memory. The clean, steady part of me she used to hold in place when family strain made everything want to tilt. Daniel exhaled through his nose. You have no idea what rooms like this are like for me. I looked at him. No, I do. I raised the boy, who was always looking around before he spoke, making sure he sounded right for whatever crowd he was standing in. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. I kept my voice low. You mean these rooms cost you something? You mean you worked hard to learn how people here talk, what they wear, what they laugh at, what they pretend not to notice? I know that. I'm not blind. Then why are you doing this? The answer to that came easier than I expected. Because you're not paying that cost yourself, I said. You're paying it with me. He stared at me, and for the first time all evening he looked less like a polished attorney and more like the boy who used to slam kitchen cabinets when homework got too hard and then feel ashamed of the noise afterward. A woman past the end of the hallway saw us and kept going. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. The important witness had already spoken. Daniel lowered his voice further. You think I'm ashamed of you? The sentence hung there. Not a question, a test. I could have made it easier then. Could have said no, not ashamed, just stressed. Could have put one more board over one more weak place and called it stability. That had been my way for too long. Keep things standing, patch what you can. Don't ask a room to hold more truth than it wants. Instead, I said, I think you've been ashamed of where you came from for so long. You don't know the difference anymore. That landed. I saw it in the tiny hard blink he gave me. His mouth worked once before he found words. You don't understand what it was like growing up around people with money. Showing up to things in that truck, wearing hand-me-down jackets, listening to people ask what you did and knowing what they heard when I answered. There it was at last. Not the whole truth maybe, but an honest piece of it. I nodded. You're right. I probably didn't understand enough of that when you were young. Something in his face eased for half a breath, like he thought concession meant rescue. Then I went on. But I understand this just fine. There's a difference between wanting more for yourself and needing the man who gave it to you to look small. He opened his mouth, closed it again. I heard heels on the hallway runner and turned. Claire was coming toward us from the banquet room, purse over one shoulder, spring coat still on over her dress. She must have come straight from the high school awards banquet she'd texted me about earlier. Her eyes moved from me to Daniel, to the picture on the wall and back again. I missed dessert, she said softly, a little out of breath. Did I miss the lie too, or just the part where it broke? Daniel's shoulders went rigid. Claire, don't. She stopped beside me. Claire had June's eyes and my mother's way of standing when she was done pretending not to notice things. I've watched you do this since college, she said to him. Tonight was just the first time somebody important saw it. Stay out of this. No. Her voice didn't rise. Dad always stays out of it. Mom used to stop you before it settled in. She's gone, so I guess that leaves me. At the mention of June, something shifted in all three of us. Silence, but not empty silence. The kind with names in it. Daniel glanced away first. That hurt more than I expected. Because their plain as day was the part I had been slowest to admit he did know. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not the bulletin in the frame. But he knew enough about me, about my life, about what hands like mine had done for his. He knew enough to know exactly what he was diminishing when he laughed. Claire touched my sleeve once. Not to hold me back, just to say she was there. Daniel straightened his tie knot, then let it go. I never asked him to come tonight. The words came out quiet, tired almost. I looked at him tearfully. No, I said. You asked because some part of you still wanted credit for bringing me. You just didn't want the whole version of me in the room. He let out one short breath that might have been anger or surrender. That's not. It is. My voice stayed level. You weren't afraid they'd think less of me. You were afraid they'd know I was yours. He flinched. It was small, barely there. But I saw it. And with that, the whole false arrangement of the evening collapsed inside me. The cheap jacket, the little warnings, the jokes, the placement at the table. It had never been about helping me. It had been about controlling the distance between his polished life and the evidence of how he got there. I thought then of June at our kitchen table years ago, hemming Claire's choir dress while I balanced invoices and a hardware receipt book under the light. Daniel upstairs studying for exams that would carry him farther than either of us had gone. June had looked up once and said, "Don't let him turn having more into thinking he comes from less." At the time, I'd laughed and told her she worried too much. I wished standing there in that hallway that she'd been wrong. Daniel spoke again, but the shine was off him now. "So what do you want me to say?" That might have been the saddest line of the night. Not because he didn't know, because he thought this was still a matter of phrasing. I looked at him a long while before I answered. "I wanted you," I said, "to know the difference between Polish and worth, before strangers had to teach it to you." His face changed then, not redeemed, not softened into anything easy, just stripped of some last defense. He looked tired, older than 42 for a second. A man standing inside the shape of what he had made. Claire said nothing. She didn't need to. I took a breath and felt under the ache of it all a strange steadiness come over me. The kind that arrives when there is no more advantage in pretending a cracked beam will hold forever. "I'm not going to make a speech," I said. "I'm not going to embarrass you on purpose. The room's already done what it needed to do." Daniel's eyes flickered toward the banquet room where people had returned to coffee and desserts and low conversation. No public shaming, no explosion, just the fact of him now standing in relation to me differently than he had an hour ago. "But I'm also not helping you with this anymore," I said. "Not with jokes, not with explanations, not with telling myself you don't mean what you keep showing me." He swallowed. I could see he wanted to say sorry. I could also see he wanted the kind of sorry that patched things fast, kept the evening intact, let him revisit the wound later in private if it still seemed useful. I was too old for that kind of repair. Claire slipped her arm through mine. "You ready to go, Dad?" I looked at Daniel one last time. All my life, I said, I figured the point was to build something my children could stand taller in. I didn't know you meant to stand farther away. Then I turned. We walked slowly toward the front hall. Claire's hand warm at my sleeve. Behind us, I heard nothing dramatic. No call after us. No crashing realization fit for a movie. Just music silverware, soft shoes on carpet, a room settling around a truth it had already accepted. At the end of the hallway, I stopped once more by the old photograph. Claire waited without speaking. I put my fingers against the edge of the frame. Cold glass. Young men beneath it who had worked in rain and smoke and bad light because something had to be rebuilt properly, or not at all. My face among them strong-backed and dark-haired and unaware of this future hurt. Beneath the glass, my name in print. Small but there. For the first time all evening, I didn't feel out of place. I felt tired. I felt sadder than I wanted to. I felt June's absence like an open chair you stop expecting to fill. But beneath all that, I felt something settle right. Not joy, not victory, order. Outside, the air had cooled enough to carry the smell of wet grass. Across the dark fairway, the sprinklers had started up in even ticking arcs. Water catching the lights from the clubhouse windows and breaking into silver for a second before disappearing again. Claire and I stood on the stone walk while the door closed softly behind us. After a moment, she said, "Mom would have been proud of you." I looked out at the course. "Your mother would have handled it better." Claire smiled a little. "Probably. But she would have said the same thing. Maybe she would have." We walked to the parking lot together. My old thrift store blazer hanging a little loose at the shoulders. My good shoes sounding plain against the stone. No one stopped us. No one needed to. The evening had already said what it was going to say. Before I got in the car, I looked back once at the lit windows of the West Wing. Part of me had built that place. Part of me had built the man still standing inside it. Only one of those things I understood now had turned out exactly the way I intended. The sprinklers kept ticking in the dark steady as a clock. And I stood there one breath longer than I needed to, feeling the cool, damp air on my face correctly seen at last and changed by it.